welcome back. I hope you did well on your Chapter 6 test. I'm sure you did. Now, in Chapter 7, we begin studying the Articles of the Confederation and the Constitution. Now, this chapter will include a great deal of information about our government. This is information that is vitally important to your understanding of the United States history. You see, U.S. history is based on the Constitution. The Constitution is a living, breathing document where the interpretation affects the outcome of, well, almost every aspect of your life if you live in the United States or are American citizens. But we'll get into clarification of that statement when we actually cover the Constitution. Just trust me when I say that understanding the Articles and the Constitution are very important. I suggest studying this chapter from the perspective of a puzzle. Examine the information like you would puzzle pieces. Each puzzle piece individually doesn't look very important, but when all of the puzzle pieces are placed in the puzzle correctly, it reveals the whole picture. That's sort of what happens when you examine the Constitution. Okay, today we're going to go over the organization and achievements of the Articles of the Confederation. We'll talk about how the Articles of the Confederation came to be ratified. We'll also discuss the powers that belong to the Congress and the states under the Articles. We'll also go over the greatest achievements of the Articles of the Confederation, the Northwest Ordinances of 1785 and 1787. Okay, so let's get started. Now, if you remember, when the colonies first started having problems with Britain, they established the First Continental Congress. Now, one of the things that they did was establish it as a continual body. When I say a continual body, I'm referring to the fact that even though everyone was going home, they were going to meet again the following spring and would continue to meet until the conflict was resolved. The colonists knew that if each colony independently tried to take a stand against Britain's policies, they would never get anywhere. The only way that they could make Britain stop was to unite. But even in uniting, each colony stressed their independence. Most colonists were afraid of a powerful government that may threaten their liberty and independence. But the Second Continental Congress realized that there had to be a permanent body so that they could appoint a committee to submit a new plan for an improved system of government. The committee came up with a confederation, a loose association or league of states. The state legislatures had been ruling their respective colonies for over a century, in some cases almost 2 centuries. I don't think many of us realize how long the colonies were around before the Revolutionary War. Virginia had been around for 169 years, and those were years that they had practiced self-government. Believe me when I say that the states knew exactly what they were doing. The idea of giving up some of that power was not going to happen easily. So a confederation was a good solution. Again, a confederation is a loose association of states. The confederation was, in a sense, a voluntary agreement to cooperate on certain matters. In most matters, the states could and would do whatever they wanted. The states saw themselves as ultimately more powerful than the federal government. Now, you might be wondering what the difference is between a confederation and a federal government. Is there a difference? Yes. Let me demonstrate the difference this way. Notice that the states in the Confederacy have solid lines around each one. Now, this represents the fact that each state is independent and retains most of the powers. The Congress is represented by a dotted line. Its power is limited, incomplete. Now notice that the main government in the federal system has the solid line because their power is the highest power and complete. The states have the dotted line because their power is limited, incomplete. See the difference? Another example is that the term United States at first was used as a plural term, and the emphasis was on the word states. Gradually, over the 19th century, especially after the Civil War, Americans came to look on themselves as one entity, and the term United States became a singular term. Now, it took a long time for Americans to view themselves first as citizens of the United States and not citizens of, say, Virginia first, and then citizens of the United States. So, in 1777, John Dickinson of Delaware drafted the Articles of the Confederation. Under the plan, members of Congress were elected each year. Now, before the Articles of the Confederation could become law, each state had to ratify them or formally approve them. But it took about 4 years for the states to agree. You see, a lot of the states didn't want to give up their western lands. You know, the land beyond the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River. The smaller states, like Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, and Rhode Island, didn't have any access to the lands west of the Appalachians. Even Pennsylvania didn't have any western lands. They clarified to the Continental Congress that they weren't about to ratify the Articles unless those western lands went to the national government. Obviously, the larger states, like Virginia, which had a huge land claim, weren't going to allow Congress to take the lands. So, finally, they came up with a compromise. Congress gained control of the western lands, putting them into what was called the public domain. In return, each state, no matter how small, had equal votes in Congress. Now, both the large states and the small states agreed with the compromise. Granted, Virginia held out on the compromise until January of 1781, but finally agreed with the compromise. They were losing their most claimed land. Keeping in mind how the states were suspect of any form of national government, it made sense that the new Congress under the Confederation had few powers. For example, Congress didn't have the power to tax. That was huge. We'll get into why that was huge in our next lesson. But the Congress did have the power to raise and maintain an army, but only if the states cooperated and sent supplies and men, which often they didn't. They could declare war, make treaties with foreign countries, manage Indian affairs, establish and run a postal system, and borrow and coin money. Although the states also had those same powers, the states could coin their own money and issue bills of credit, deal directly with foreign governments, and even declare war. Yeah, Congress's hands were often tied by the states demanding their rights or even ignoring Congress altogether. Now, there were certain powers that were held only by the states. The states controlled both domestic and foreign trade. Believe me, when I say that life would have been much simpler if Congress could have regulated trade. But the states weren't into that idea at all. The states alone had rights to tax citizens. Now, under the new plan, laws could be passed only when 9 of the 13 states approved them. Not so bad, but the problem came with the amending process. The amending process is the process that a document must go through to be changed. Obviously, this was the country's first attempt, really one of the first attempts in the world to establish an independent nation. They were bound to make mistakes, but they established that all 13 states had to agree to change the articles. That was tough, an almost impossible requirement to get a unanimous vote from 13 independently minded states. Now, don't get me wrong. The states did agree to cooperate in some matters. First, they agreed to give full faith and credit to other states' public civil acts. In other words, they respected the other states' birth, marriage, and death certificates and wills. Secondly, they agreed to return criminals and runaway slaves who crossed state lines. Thirdly, they agreed to settle their differences by arbitration. In other words, 2 states involved in a disagreement would let a mutually acceptable third party help them reach a solution rather than fight over the issue. Now, actually look at the Articles of the Confederation, or at least part of it. take a few minutes to read the articles on page 47 of your student activities workbook, and then we'll go over the questions on page 48. So let's go over some of the questions on page 48 that deal with the primary document, the Articles of the Confederation. The first question is really important to understand the articles. Why do you think the article on state sovereignty, which was Article 2, was placed so early in the articles? What in that article showed the founders' commitment to limited government? Well, all the states definitely had strong opinions about being able to govern themselves, and each state wanted to deal with its unique problems in its own way. The founders' commitment to limited government can be seen in that the articles gave the national government only specific powers, and all powers not specifically delegated to that government were retained by the states. Number 2, what was the central need that united the states in this national government? Their common need for defense and security from their enemies. At the time of the introduction of the articles, that would have been Britain. Number 3, what essential freedom did Article 4 guarantee? It guaranteed the freedom of the citizens of every state to move about among, into, and out of all other states. In other words, if you were in New York and wanted to go to Virginia, you didn't have to show your passport to go through Pennsylvania and Maryland. Number 4, how many votes did each state have in the Confederation Congress? Remember, the compromise gave each state equal representation. The states were equally represented by 1 vote each. Number 5, according to Article 6, what powers and privileges were to be the sole responsibility of the National Congress and forbidden to the individual states? Conducting foreign relations and waging war, except in the event of invasion or when the threat was so imminent as to make it dangerous to delay defensive actions to consult Congress. Number 6, what provision was made for settling disputes between states? Congress would be the final arbiter in such disputes. Why do you think Article 11 mentions Canada? Because at the time that the Articles of the Confederation were written and approved, many people thought that Canada would soon want to be part of the Union of States. Okay, so let's get back to the achievements of the Articles of the Confederation. Although the Confederation lasted only 8 years, it did accomplish some good things. The most important legislation passed by the Confederation Congress dealt with the Western lands. They had to deal with those issues, considering it was the hot topic in the ratification process. They couldn't just ignore it. They came up with 2 pieces of legislation, the Northwest Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. I know it's a bit confusing. The names are too similar, but I didn't name them. Congress did. Now, first, the Northwest Ordinance of 1785. Congress gained control of the Northwest Territory. This was the land bounded on the east by the original 13 colonies, on the west by the Mississippi River, on the north by the Great Lakes, and on the south by the Ohio River. The southwestern territories were a little fuzzy on whether they were controlled by Congress. Technically, they were, but their settlement was more random than the Northwest Territories. The Northwest Ordinance of 1785 provided for the surveying and sale of the territory. It divided the land into areas of 6 miles square or 36 square miles called townships. Now, each township was subdivided into 36 smaller parcels, each 1 square mile, called sections. A section contained 640 acres. Now, 1 section of land in each township was set aside for education. The townships built schools there so that most rural children could go to school for at least part of the year. The ordinance also called for the sale of the land at auction. The minimum price was $1 an acre. Can you imagine? $1 an acre? A buyer had to purchase at least one section or 640 acres. Congress could have definitely sold the land for more, but they wanted to make sure that the people that didn't have a lot of money could have a chance to buy land. Problem? They sold the land in large chunks. A lot of people couldn't afford $640, which was what it would cost to buy 640 acres. Yes, it was a great deal, but people of modest incomes didn't have that kind of money. Congress ended up selling a lot of the territory to several large land companies. The Ohio Company is probably the best known of these companies. But before Congress could sell the land, they had to have legal title to it. So they made treaties with the Indians to buy the land in the Northwest Territory. They hoped that the treaties would prevent Indian uprisings like Pontiac's Rebellion. Another result of the Northwest Ordinance was the way that most of the new territories and states were surveyed. Farms and roads were laid out in straight lines and right angles. This layout can still be seen today, especially in the Midwest and the Plain States. Then the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 provided governments for the large tracts of Western land. It divided the land into territories. Each territory had a congressionally appointed governor, judges, courts, and a secretary. When the population in a territory reached 5,000 free white males of voting age, the region could elect its own territorial legislature. Then, when the population in a territory grew to 60,000, the people in the territory could apply for statehood. Eventually, 5 states were created from the Northwest Territory. The Northwest Ordinance guaranteed freedom of religion and forbid slavery in the Northwest Territory. Therefore, the Ohio River became the dividing line between the slave states and the free states. Also, the Congress, under the Articles, published journals of its proceedings. These journals developed into today's congressional record. It also used the decimal system for the money it coined. This system, based on tens and hundreds, is the basis of the money system Americans use today. Okay, so let's do a quick review of what we talked about today. Now, in this chapter, I'm going to stop giving you detailed notes. I'll still go over what we covered in outline form. You just won't see the outline. So we talked about how the Continental Congresses and the state assemblies had governed the colonies throughout most of the War for Independence. Before the war, the state legislatures practiced self-government, so the colonies really did understand the concept of government. The Continental Congress, because the states were jealous of their authority in their respective states, chose to form a confederation, or a loose association or league of states. Under the plan, the government had one governing body, a Congress, whose members were to be elected yearly. The adoption of the Articles of the Confederation took a long time. Before it could become law, it had to be ratified or formally approved. The small states wouldn't agree until the large states gave up their claims to Western lands. They compromised. The large states gave up their lands, and the small states got equal representation. Virginia held out on the compromise, but eventually gave up their lands north of the Ohio River. The political power under the Articles gave Congress very few powers. Certain powers were held only by the states. The right to tax citizens was held only by the states. The lasting achievements of the Articles of the Confederation were the Northwest Ordinances of 1785 and 1787. These were the most important legislations passed by the Confederation Congress. They dealt with the Western lands. The Northwest Ordinance of 1785 divided the land into areas of 6 miles square, or 36 square miles, called townships. This ordinance provided for the surveying and sale of the territory. To sell the land, Congress had to have the legal title, so they made treaties with the Indians. Congress hoped that the treaties would prevent Indian uprisings. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 provided governments for the large tracts of Western land. It divided the land into territories. When the population in a territory grew to 60,000, the people in the territory could apply for statehood. Okay, so next time, we'll focus in on the weaknesses of the Articles of the Confederation. Until then, have an amazing day.